A letter has reached my hands about these experiences of mine, written in a courteous spirit, but supplying so singular a comment on my story that I shall answer it here. It is from a specialist who has obtained, I conclude, some eminence in the treatment of insanity, for it encloses for my study, in the form of a pamphlet, a presidential address on the subject delivered by him 2 or 3 years ago. With a few points in his letter I must deal, for they are as curious an instance of what schoolmen call the ignoratio elenchi as I am likely to meet. The writer in The World, he says, confesses himself in various passages to have been insane. He suggests that I may possibly be merely a clever romance writer, but deprecating my able onslaught on those medical men who have the dire misfortune to be engaged in lunacy practice, adds that if my story is genuine, I am bound to offer some suggestion as to the proper mode of treatment of the unfortunate victims of brain disease, and that as I have entered on a destructive course, I am in duty bound to finish by a constructive attempt. Now for my answer. In the heading of this narrative, and throughout it, I deny distinctly, deliberately, categorically, that I have ever been insane, and I say that the fancies of delirium or hypochondria are as clearly to be distinguished from those of madness as midday from midnight, on a very little close observation by every honest and unselfish mind. To send them to an asylum for treatment is the best way to turn them to insanity. I have been perfectly frank about my delusions, for I remember them all, as had I been mad I should not. A man may doubt if he is in his mind or no. He cannot doubt whether or not he has been. The writer of the letter takes advantage of my having been in an asylum, as some of the friends who placed me there have done, to argue that I was mad. It is the favourite fallacy of the cart before the horse. It proves me to have been legally insane, of course, and I give the phrase for what it is worth, with a contempt no words can imagine. The doctors who made themselves the instruments of this wrong were 2 young village practitioners who never made any study of the matter, and one of them never saw me but 5 minutes in his life, when I was too ill in body to mark his face. Is this a state of law that should last? Is this a thing that should be let alone? Read some of Ruskin's Fors Clavigera, gentlemen, and get rid of some of the selfishness which is the dry rot of mankind, for which a placid acceptance of the wrongs of others is only another name. Scourge the money changers from the temples, in the warrior spirit of him whose name we still bear. The very pamphlet before me speaks of nothing so much as of the special knowledge required in dealing with insanity. Yet any 2 apothecaries may make a man mad in law. Let the very possibility of it be abolished. There is the first part of the reform which the writer wants me to suggest, for which in my first chapter I warned him and all others that they have no right to ask me. I am neither Home Secretary, Commissioner, next friend, nor medical man, and it is no answer for the author of a book to say to his critic, "Come up and write a better." Ne sutor ultra crepidam, quotes the writer in his pamphlet, and it is true of me as of him. It is only my clear duty to set down, in words that shall burn, if God will send them to me, the breathing thoughts that spring, too deep for tears, out of my terrible personal experience. For this is no romance, but a commonplace reality. I have said with whom the responsibility for the reform lies, with the Home Secretary and Commissioners, and with the leading men in law and medicine who allow these things to be. When Sidney Smith said that nothing could be done with a corporate body of men because they have neither a soul to be damned nor a body to be kicked, he may not have been as right as in the first clause as in the last. Souls may one day prove as divisible as the electric light, and before the court beyond, to which I, and others who have suffered like me, from our very heart of hearts appeal, it will be of no use to plead a limited liability. I will go on with my suggestions of reform, though I am not bound to do so, for I believe the key to be simple. The lunacy laws are made in the supposed interests of relatives, not the sufferers themselves, and all is done to hush up, not to expose. Why? There is nothing to be ashamed of in insanity, but in their utter selfishness. Friends shrink from the supposed consequences to themselves if the thing is talked about, as if it could ever be anything else. The birds of the air will carry the matter, and all that these people gain by it is to have the increasing sect of the head shakers, as a friend of mine has pleasantly christened them, tongue-wagging more and more behind their backs, and saying, "Ah, poor people, madness in the family, you know." And it serves them very justly right. I know these same head shakers well, and know well enough that they will never allow me to escape from the consequences of the past, such as they are. There was something in it, you know. He was very queer. Pas de fumée sans feu. Proverbs are either the greatest lies or the greatest truths, and in society certainly this is one of the first sort. I was caught in the act of laughing at a play of my own only the other day, and I hear that a head shaker spoke of it at the Mutton Chops Club afterwards as a melancholy sign of my mental condition. They congregate much at some latter-day clubs, the members of this sect, and in absence of a natural material in that way, they tell each other what to think, and then go home and think it. Applied to literary work, the result sometimes comes forth as criticism. Let no man then be imprisoned for insanity till his state has been fully and carefully observed for a certain time, nor then unless the certificate has been signed by 2 or more well-qualified and practised men, one of whom at least should have known the patient well and long. Let private asylums, where it is in the interest of the proprietors to keep the patients as long as they can, be swept away. I have known the enrolment of new patients on their books. May the poor people be helped, and those who place them there forgiven, cited with as much pride as that of new boys at a schoolmaster's. Let public asylums be substituted, where it is in all interests to have as few patients as possible instead of as many, and to dismiss them as soon as may be. Let the harmless, of whom there is a large proportion, be kept out of the asylums altogether. Who knows what cruel pain the associations of their life may hourly give them? Let publicity take the place of hushing up, which never did any good in the world whatever, to the fullest extent. Let the warders, whom I have postponed for the present in deference to their social betters, be carefully selected for character and kindness, and be what they should be, nurses of the sick. Let the commissioners, if they are to go on existing, read their duty in a different way. Further, let severe criminal penalties attach to every abuse of the reformed lunacy law, and let every facility be given to the sufferer as against doctors, relations, commissioners, anybody, be he great as he may. At present the law, with all its intricate machinery for good or ill, fights dead against us. With my correspondent's plea for the sensibilities of those engaged in this line of practice, I am not much concerned. They need not adopt it if they do not like, I suppose. They follow their profession for profit like the rest of us, and have no need to pose as philanthropists, or ask for sympathy. Il faut vivre will be their best explanation of their work, and I know of no case in which the great Frenchman's answer would come with more crushing force. Monsieur, je n'en vois pas la nécessité. If these suggestions of mine, which I did not propose to offer, savour rather of the destructive, to use my correspondent's phrase, it is because destruction is the only reform possible, and to patch up the old system is like mending worn-out garments with older cloth. When reform, utter and complete, has been devised and carried out, insanity may be eliminated. I quote the same writer again, more than he thinks, for a blessing may fall on men's efforts, which seems very justly denied to them now. As long as this form of false imprisonment is possible, as long as scores of sane men and women are being maddened in private asylums, and hundreds of mad people being driven madder, insanity in England will not decrease. As for its proper medical treatment, I have nothing to do with it, and nothing to say to it. I take up my correspondent's address at his desire, in the hope of learning something, and this sentence is among the first to catch my eye. Voisin says that in simple insanity he finds certain alterations in the grey matter of the cerebrum, consisting of minute apoplexies, effusions of hæmatin and hæmatosin into the lymphatic sheaths, infarctions, atheroma, capillary dilations, and necrosis of vessels, and certain changes of cerebral cells. Quite so. It may all be very true, but I can offer no suggestions as to the medical treatment based upon these remarkable assumptions. When, shortly before my final removal, I was allowed to see a relation of mine at a town at some distance off, the principal objected to the permission being too often given, because conversation carried off too much white matter from the brain. I distinctly assert that he said white, because by connotation of the statement with Voisin's valuable remarks, it will appear that grey remained in my case unaffected. That neither haematin nor haematocin has been effused into my sheaths, that my capillaries remain undilated, and that I am proudly conscious of having escaped both atheroma and infarctions, I must ask my readers to accept my word. What abominable nonsense is all this, and how soon may such nonsense degenerate into evil? In another part of the same pamphlet I find the writer presently citing this Voisin's recommendation of the strait waistcoat, on the ground that the patients like it. There, I think, it is as well to lay the treatise down. To take up again the thread of my personal story, I have described how I was called homicidal. Where my voices came from, to which I alluded in my first chapter, I never understood, for indeed I have not the faintest notion what they mean. They are used as a yoke horse with delusions, and being simply nonsensical, they admit of no possible answer. As far as I can remember, after old Diaphorus had asked me a variety of questions to find out the especial form of madness for which my friends had committed me to his tender mercies, and become naturally more puzzled as he went on, he suggested voices as a last desperate resource, and I, being rather tired of the business, having thus far been unable to admit a single symptom propounded, jumped at the solution as being purely idiotic. I presume that I must have admitted that at times, when I am alone and doing nothing, I am able to fancy to myself the speech and address of absent friends. Heaven knows I needed the fancy there. It struck me as a harmless admission, and when I was once afterwards gravely informed that voices are about the most dangerous and incurable sign of mental alienation, even in my extremity I could not help being tickled by the profound absurdity of the whole thing. Voices, said my friend of the Inverness to me one day in a moment of confidence. He too was able to discourse pleasantly enough of old college times, poetry, and other matters when he chose. They are always bothering me about voices, and I don't know what the devil they mean. This man has been a hopeless prisoner for some time, but he was so far wiser than I that he only admitted to hearing voices indoors. I rashly allowed that I heard them quite as often out of doors as in. I hear them often when I am hungry, summoning me with much emphasis to my meals. This idea of voices was in my case a suggestion of the doctor's, thrown out innocently enough, perhaps, in the first instance, but it did me in my illness fearful harm. It may be felt by all who know how much, at the best of times, some old tune or scrap of odd verse will haunt and worry us, with what tenacity this fancy, once implanted, would take root and bud in a brain, always active and imaginative, and then, wearied and overworn by long weakness, and incapable of the brave effort by which alone such contemptible nonsense could be shaken off amid its grotesque and terrible surroundings. And then wearied and overworn by long weakness, and incapable of the brave effort by which alone such contemptible nonsense could be shaken off amid its grotesque and terrible surroundings. Harried and bothered about fits, voices, delusions, white matters and grey, ill beyond belief and longing for nothing but good food and rest, but watched day and night, night and day, speculating what and who all these people might be, irritated by the doctors and insulted by the attendants, vigorously kicked by one of them one morning, I remember, when my hands were too weak to do their office, and I did not dress myself quick enough to please him. That I should be here now, sound and strong, I may well attribute to some power above the selfishness of men, which will not suffer these infamies to go too far. After the usual fashion in such cases, the doctor of that place may now claim credit for my cure. I will show, before I have done, how he cut himself off, by his own deliberate statement, from the possibility of claiming it. Over these voices of his I brooded and brooded till they assumed something very like reality. I thought in my wretchedness of some dead and gone who would have shielded me from this with their lives, till their unforgotten voices became at last a very part and parcel of my individual being, if a certified madman may presume to claim it. They comforted me, and yet they haunted me, till at last I can almost believe that they became to me guardian angels, like the voices of Joan of Arc. Small chance would she have stood in the hands of British specialists. England might have punished her worse than by faggots if she had handed her over to them. For me, had I to choose again between the most painful death and another term of imprisonment in the asylum best beloved of the Commissioners, I should scarcely hesitate a moment in my selection of the first. These voices of the doctor's creation were to be cast in my teeth again and again. One of the 3 questions vouchsafed me by a Commissioner during the whole period related to them, and when I say again what I said in my first chapter, that they are the worst piece of humbug of all, I believe that I speak the truth, which is difficult where all is humbug. I have his leave to quote here the words of a friend's letter written about this history of mine. He spent one night at this same asylum upon a visit there to a patient. Well, you may say there is but one thing that can enable a man to bear such a trial. I often wonder how I got through that night, and how it was I did not find myself between 2 keepers next morning. I am sure I heard voices enough, but they were holy ones. This friend, who was not allowed to see me, was on a visit to a brother of his, whom I have described as having interested himself in my release. He had first been spirited away to another asylum, from which he was afterwards transferred, when his brother was but a few yards distant, knowing nothing of what was being done. He knew his brother to be sane, maintained it throughout, and at last succeeded in releasing him. A few facts in the story are a good pendant to mine. The victim in this instance had been engaged in all the worries of an election, when some friend took him to consult an eminent mad doctor who owned a private asylum in London. The doctor said that he thought him out of his mind. My friend went and demanded his reasons. The answer was that throughout a long conversation he had shown himself perfectly reasonable and consecutive, but on going away he had taken up the doctor's hat instead of his own. Forcible as this argument was, it was not enough, even in the opinion of relatives, to shut the man up for. But on a later occasion he became excited about something, and the same authority was again privately consulted. No information was given to my friend, but early in the morning this doctor sent 2 keepers from his own asylum, ready to wait for the result of an interview between the patient and 2 doctors, suddenly sprung upon him, one an utter stranger, under whose certificates he was then and there removed. When my friend heard of it, he took steps at once, but found he could do nothing. The law provides that the 2 certifying doctors shall not be partners. One of these was in the habit of taking the business of the other in his absence. This was his partner, said my friend, when looking about for redress. Not a registered partner, I am afraid, was the legal answer. The Common Law Procedure Act, I fear, has failed to abolish special pleading, or to efface from the lesser legal mind the delusion, may I use the word, that the object of law is to defeat justice. For some time the prisoner remained in this asylum, and he so far justifies the Commissioners in their preference, that he describes that where I was confined, to which he was transferred, as good in comparison. In that other place he had no room of his own, and was herded always with all the mad indiscriminately. The only exercise they were allowed was within the walls of the grounds, the asylum being in London. He was denied pen and ink, but he saw the warders do such things that he contrived to pencil down some notes of what he saw, and succeeded at last in obtaining the materials and writing to the Commissioners of what he had seen. We were allowed to write to the Commissioners if we found out our right. How many such letters we contrive to write, how many are sent if written, how many are read if sent, how many acted upon if read, I do not know. In this instance these ordeals were all past, for the Commissioners came, made an inquiry, and did nothing. But the objectionable patient was removed to another place, where I met him during my second term. Sane patients must be in some respects a trial. I understand that my old doctor frankly complains that I was the greatest bore whom he ever had in his care, and I believe it, though at the close of our relations he did not seem too anxious to get rid of me. We saw very little of each other then, my fellow prisoner and I, for it might have been awkward, but enough to recognise each other's sanity. His brother was working hard for him, and at last 2 impartial doctors were sent down from town to inquire into his case. We have a right to demand that also, I have understood since, though how but by a miracle we can use that right, I do not know. When it is gained, of what service is it likely to be in such a place, prejudiced as the new doctors must naturally be, over anxious as the victim must be, who dares not be excited and therefore natural, painful as the cross-examination is? Nevertheless, in this case the 2 doctors, one of them famous in nervous cases, certified this man to be sane, and left the certificate on record. It was kept back 1 month. I state the facts of this story upon my friend's authority, and by his permission. My friend worked hard without, as his brother did within, and the hard-earned freedom was won at last. It matters not to tell how. When I was myself freed, I travelled for some time with my old fellow prisoner, and never saw in him one sign or trace of insanity. An eminent medical baronet, with a curiously suggestive name, who was rather a patron of the establishment, and occasionally diagnoses a lunatic at an odd hour, had, a little time before, solemnly pronounced from the tremor of his tongue, a member which, from my own experience, is apt to tremesce when one is nervous, that he was bound to have something dreadful, it matters not what, within a month. However, it is now very many months, and he has not had it. Slang is expressive sometimes. Bosh! The baronet is said to be infallible at diagnosing from the tongue this especial malady, which failed to appear. My friend had no illness, but those people had shaken his nerves, as for a long space they shook mine. The wickedness was done. How many are there who, in the face of such truths as these, can dare to disbelieve in him who says still as he said of old, "Shall not my soul be avenged on such a generation as this?" It is all very well to go to church and say prayers, to quarrel about the form of your faith, the colour of your clothes, the number of your bows. Religion is an active, not a passive word, and, like revolutions, it is not made with rose-water. Do something, somebody. Let me close this chapter with my first escape, as my readers may well be tiring of my story. After some months of stupid unconsciousness, I was sent for change to the seaside annex of which I spoke. What the matron said, after the short time of quiet observation which was all I needed, has been told. What I felt when I learned from her where I was, I need not say. Very good for me was the association with her, who would rescue me from my companions and my warders, to take me out with her for a drive or a walk, in spite of the homicidal tendencies of which she had been warned. By her a relation was summoned to see me apart from the associations of the asylum, who had never seen me at all since the wrong was done, and seeing had no choice but to remove me, though every obstacle was thrown in the way, by the commissioners even, who, shirking their own responsibility, accepted for a salary, are glad enough to throw it upon anybody. Very good for me also was the association with the young doctor, a son of the principal, and his wife, who lived in the next house in charge of the branch. They had me in to sup or play whist with them in the evenings, and said as the matron said. The young doctor took it upon himself, in spite of orders, to let me sleep in my room unwatched and alone, for the first time for many months, and the relief was beyond words. "I wish," he said in answer to one of my questions, "that you would simply stuff all the food and drink you can get." When I was again, after some months of liberty, remitted to the asylum, I heard that he had given up all connection with it, with the regret with which one misses a personal friend. But I think that I was glad to hear it, even then. He had a comfortable berth enough had he cared to keep it, but he preferred to buy himself a general practice and to go. I do not wonder. Shakespeare was not as right as usual when he said that conscience doth make cowards of us all, for there are some of whom it makes brave men. It is the worst of enemies, but it is the best of friends, and the most easily conciliated, if we try in the right way. But I will moralize no more. The headshakers have a formal vocabulary of their own, which, after a certain experience, one begins to know by heart. It is constructed on the simple principle of giving a bad name to everything. This story has been called sensational, when it is simply true. When a direct description of things as they are is sensational, things as they are not things as they should be. I am told, too, that the story shows much disregard for people's feelings. It certainly does for mine, which are sensitive enough, and have been outraged beyond belief. When men condescend to think a little less of their own feelings and a little more of theirs whom they shut up alive, we shall be on the road to amendment. Meanwhile, if anything I have written has at all hurt the natural sensitiveness of any who has suffered as I have, I am very sorry for it. To other feelings in the matter I am less than indifferent. Let the galled jade wince, our withers are unwrung. These chapters are not intended to be read as what my friend of the pamphlet calls them, an onslaught on the medical man engaged in lunacy practice. They are an onslaught on a crying national sin, and all who favour it. Among the men in lunacy practice are men who abhor the system on which any man may be writ down mad. Among them I have myself found one of the best friends I have had. He was one of old standing. He saw me when I was nearly at my worst, but he did not shut me up. He took me to his own house and poured in oil and wine like the good Samaritan he is. After a few days' entertainment with his own family, and at his own table, and he would never have of me 1 penny for his infinite pains, he assured me, and my friends too, that I was only a hypochondriac bound to get well. He would have made me so, if I would have consented to stay with him, in spite of a certain faith in hydrate of chloral, which I wish he would abandon. Hell in crystals, my defining friend has called it. Perhaps I may add here that the relation who should know me best testified to my sanity with as little variation. I well remember how this warm-hearted doctor carried me off under his own protest to see an eminent dietist who I would consult, so completely had the occult qualities of eggs and cold mutton been worried into me, and almost shouted as he left the room, in answer to the stereotyped, "I hope you are very particular about his diet." Diet be strong-worded, why the man is dying of inanition. So I was. But I was restlessly bent on my own ruin, it would seem, and "tu l'as voulu, Georges Dandin" was the burden of my earliest asylum dreams. The rolling stone would only stop in the breakers at the bottom of the cliff, and I found no Sisyphus to roll it up again till I played both stone and Sisyphus myself. Why, however, I was thus hastily shut up without any reference to so skilled a friend, and without seeing him, I do not know. It was of him that I was thinking when I suggested what I believe to be one of the most important and easiest of necessary reforms, that no man should be certificated without the assent of at least one valuable authority who knows him well, after careful personal examination. I have gone back again on my story, and a breath of sea air will do it good. Imagine me with the matron again. The change from the asylum and its associations to the little house by the seaside was very good in its effects. It was so for others than me, for the madmen there, poor fellows, seemed to me gentler and better in every way than they were when I saw them in the larger place. The warders were there to watch them, but had to be quiet and suppressed in a private house, and simply lived downstairs as servants live. The breakfasts and dinners at the neat table, presently presided over by a womanly hostess, were a relief indeed after my previous experience. That they should have proved so, when only she and I held consecutive conversation, and the other guests either kept silence or distracted us by strange words and antics enough to unnerve anybody, shows partially, I think, what the life which they relieved must have been. The poor singer of the Hey Diddle Diddle beer song was in the house, and his way of carving his bread with his knife and fork intrigued me much till the matron told me where I was. There, too, was the good parsley eater, who died of Bright's disease, and it was there, just after I left the house, that he died. Only 2 or 3 days before he had to sit down to dine with us, I remember the kindness with which the matron had made him lie down upon the sofa, seeing the suffering of which he knew not how to speak, and sent him to his bed. A short time before he had calmly looked me in the face across the table, and pledged me in the vinegar cruet, which he emptied. His brother, a clergyman, dined with us on a visit, and looked at me, I thought, with some curiosity. What was I doing dans cette galère struck me more than one. Seen among the associations and scenes of the asylum, I believe that anyone might perhaps have thought me unfit to be removed, so completely ignorant was I, in common phrase, whether I was on my head or my heels. Twice a day, in the regular course of things, were the 7 or 8 lunatics who composed the seaside colony marched out for a constitutional walk, with a pack of warders at their heels, in the direction opposite to the town and streets. Those walks were trying enough at the asylum, among the country roads and lanes. They had been fearful. The matron saved me from them as much as possible, as I have said, with the most thoughtful and considerate kindness. She took me with her to hear the band upon the pier, and to stroll about with her, a prisoner on parole, among the holiday makers of the popular watering place, and those diversions which seem dull enough in ordinary life appeared to me quite exceptionally delightful. It was better when we talked of books and things and people, and what she said and wrote of me I have already told. In the evening she would rescue me from the rest to let me sup quietly with herself, when I did not go next door to supper or whist with the young doctor and his pleasant wife, who were in command of a detachment of female patients there. They, too, gave their opinion, and in the face of many remonstrances from quarters where I might least have expected them, in the face of the principal's opinion that I was a very dangerous person, in the face of Her Majesty's admirable commissioners, not one of whom I had to my knowledge so far seen, but who were well armed with the notes of the warders, I was taken for the time away and made a free man again. O spirit of Mr. Justice Darley! Nathaniel, sir? How could I have got Daniel on my notes, unless you told me, sir? If the soldiers, sailors, tinkers, tailors of the establishment had it down in their notes that I was mad, having been told so, to begin with, by their employers, who dilate on the delicacy of brain cases, yet trust the reports of ignorant men, how the deuce could I be anything else? Yet there was more than one of them, for all that, who did not believe it, and had the courage to say so. I will give no clue to their identities, for they might be dismissed retrospectively, if they are still in harness, for such a breach of duty. It would be the best thing that could happen to them, perhaps. The hardest part of the whole snare to me was that I, who would not hurt a dog if I could help it, was represented as violent when I was weaker than any dog. It was enough to deter any but the bravest and kindliest from trying to help me, and I have no choice but to suppose that that was the object. But the violence and the rest of it was too palpable a lie. The deliverance came. Over the months which followed before I came to be imprisoned again, matron and young doctor gone, good plants flourish ill in such a soil as that, I wish to pass as lightly as possible. They would have chiefly to do with home matters which have no place in such a story as this, and only concern consciences to which I would have nothing to say. I have done with them, let them alone. The period of my freedom lasted 10 months. I spent the time in aimless wandering from place to place, among the bathers of Trouville and the playgoers of Paris, in the hotels and streets of London, in a fashion which would make a story by itself, were this the place to set it down. The shock with which I had learned what had been done to me had shaken to the centre what nerve the treatment had left me. Night after night I did nothing but dream of the asylum and its terrors. The warders, whose faces I knew so well, were always behind me. The antics of the madmen were reacted with merciless fidelity. The sense of utter helplessness in the hands of mad doctors, which the experience had left upon my mind, would leave me neither night nor day. A traveller's chance allusion in my hearing to Bedlam Let Loose, or a whimsical song about Charenton in French vaudeville, would drive me out of the station or the theatre in helpless fear of I knew not what. If a gendarme accosted me at night in the streets, I shook all over in the expectation of being removed to a French asylum. If I saw an advertisement relating to an asylum in a casual newspaper, it was to lay it down in terror. There seemed to me but one power in the world, the power of the lunacy law. Such is the confidence which our vaunted system, which professes to know no wrong without a remedy, could inspire in one who needed its protection so sorely as I. In one respect its might was certainly vindicated, for abroad and at home I thought that it could reach me anywhere. I kept these fears of mine as much as I could to myself, for to talk of them might be, under the circumstances of my life, to be shut up at once again. But it was a fearful trial. I was utterly cowed and frightened, and I was afraid to face anyone, for I thought I read in every face a knowledge of my story. Except by an occasional desperate effort, I could force myself to meet no one. But ill as I was then, and full of fancies, not one of the old friends who saw me imagined in me a trace of insanity. That I know. In Paris especially I found one old literary friend to whose rooms, from that odd thing called sympathy, I suppose, I was able to go more often than anywhere else, though seldom enough, heaven knows. I have often wondered since what are his real thoughts in the matter. In theatres and hotels, in streets and in cafes, seldom allowing myself to sleep more than 1 or 2 consecutive nights in the same place, from the fear of being taken, and when I did stay, afraid of going to my room and then of leaving it. I'd read this dreary word chiefly alone. And by the odd irony of the whole thing, this was the time when I was indeed nearest to madness, and really required careful watching, not that of warders or of repression, be it understood, but of the affection which is unhappily not made to order. I had been called suicidal and homicidal when I was no danger to anybody. Now thoughts of suicide did indeed take shape and form in my mind. In that there was no madness, for the impulse which madness supplies to carry these wretched thoughts into effect failed me always, and so saved my life. Yet there was not a day at last when I did not leave the house with the intention, if I could only find the needed courage, of bringing this impossible existence to an end. I knew that I was not going to die, but I believed that, after the line of treatment so shamefully adopted once, to save trouble, there was little chance of escaping a second condemnation if I did not die, and the event proved me miserably right. Have I not cause to say that I have no special call to spare the susceptibilities of others? I have no respect left for Pickwickian feelings. None. London was but a repetition of the story of Paris. I struggled to the theatre once or twice. One night I hid myself at the back of the pit to listen to a play of my own which had just been brought out with some success, written, of course, some time before. I thought publicity dangerous, and wondered stupidly if I had ever written such things myself. After some months in the country, where I tried to make a home life in vain, and wore myself out more and more in the long solitary walks, haunted by every kind of nervous fear, I went back again to London in despair, wondering if, as I had no courage to die, this would not in some way end itself by sheer force of exhaustion. It would not, for I was very full of life still. I let nobody know where I was, for I had no strength or care to write, and no one with whom I cared to communicate. Besides, I was afraid, and wandered from one hotel to another with a sort of hope of having become nobody. I had forfeited my individuality in the asylum. Why want it back again? But I had to be accounted for, and one day at the Crystal Palace I found myself watched again by a gloomy man, not with a yataghan, but a newspaper. Of course I thought he was a keeper, as I had been expecting that for some time, but he was only a detective. He was not very unlike some whom I have seen in plays, for he allowed me to detect his mission in a moment, and it gave me a certain grim amusement to lead him all over the gardens on a very unpleasant day, taking the most obvious notes of me that I ever saw in an obtrusive red pocket-book. I strolled to the verge of the salt flood at the bottom of the gardens, not deep, where the antediluvians dwell, lingered about, and looked as if I meant to jump in. He showed no intention of interfering, but watched with interest from the opposite shore, and nearly filled his pocket-book. Then I disappointed him. I turned away from the precipice like Box the printer, went down to the refreshment room and ate an ice. This bothered him a good deal, but he noted it down. In the train he got into a carriage conspicuously remote from mine, met a mate in London to whom he communicated his ideas, and, after watching me partake of a melancholy dinner in Lucas's comfortable coffee room, while he dallied with buns and beer in the front shop, the two followed me to Mr. Hare's pleasant little theatre. I had never dared, after the lowering effect of the associations of the establishment, which seemed to sink me in my own esteem, to raise my eyes above the pit, sat behind me and watched my conduct in respect of Gilbert's broken hearts, with a regretful desire evident in their own minds for something spicy, then saw me safe to my hotel for the nonce, and departed with a conscientious feeling of having done their duty detectively, and having entirely escaped my observation. Were they primary scholars in the work, I wonder? And which kept the more accurate notes, the watcher in his book, or the watched in his head? Nothing surprises me more, as I think over all that dreary time, than the singular acuteness of observation in me, which no date or detail seems to have escaped. Hyperesthesia, I suppose, or derangement of the white matter. Perhaps it was an infarction. Well, by the superhuman exertions of Inspector Bucket I had been tracked to my lair, and a doctor descended upon me the next morning, and asked me a few more questions. But he was the one of whom I have spoken as having given a worthy brain to earnest work, and having so signally condemned asylums and delusions. No man could have been more kind and wise. He might well have been deceived into thinking me mad, I think, for by this time, with voices, delusions, visions, and all the nonsense drummed into me, I had well nigh begun to think myself so. I had hardly any clothes with me, as I wandered with the impression that there must be a full stop somewhere near. I had not brushed my hair. I looked utterly dazed, and had taken refuge in the smallest room on the topmost story of one of our largest hostelries. If I had been charged as an escaped convict, answer had been difficult. He was not deceived, though, and ordered the rest of mind and body which is sometimes as vain a prescription as port wine and sea air to the wasted pauper. Failing better roads to it, I was sent off to a hydropathic establishment in the north, once more in the charge of a body servant, who was not to lose sight of me upon the road. Ay de mi! All the hopeless old story was coming on again. I knew that palace of the water cure well. I had known pleasant days there in happier times, when I thought I would go thither and bathe for no special reason, and had amused myself much with the whims and oddities of the place. All the people going to Gravesend by water, as Sir George Rose used to say. It had been the property of a kindly Scotchman since gone, who has left me pleasant memories of his home circle and his private stock of whisky, which he administered to me freely at night, when the water washers were gone to bed, after instructing me in the theoretic virtues of abstinence in his council chamber in the morning. Now, like other places of the kind, it had lost its home shape, and passed into the impersonal hands of a company. The presiding medical authority was now a different man. I wonder if he dreams of me sometimes? The first night after reaching the place a crash came. I could bear this espial no longer, and the dreams of dead dear ones had become so vividly mixed with the nightmare horrors inherited from, what shall I call the asylum? Pecksniff Hall, that I never knew half I was doing. The professional name for dreams, as I said before, is visions. Dreaming that a warder was upon me, that a ghost was telling me to run, I jumped up in my sleep and rolled over the nearest banisters. The fall was not severe, and the desperate attempt failed, for I only broke a rib and stove in my breastbone, which proved afterwards handy for the warders to work upon. I was put to bed for a time and taken some care of, and before long was able to drive and stroll about again and join in lawn tennis. But the dream fears and the daily terrors haunted me still, and I still shrank from everybody. At last came the realization of my constant fear, and I fell into a fit of light-headed wandering, and began calling out at intervals various silly things. What should have been done was to nurse me and pour wine down my throat, and apply the common means of homely restoration. What was done was this. The stout bathman and servants of the place were sent to hold me down, and I was gagged and left gagged till the blood ran down from my mouth. Then came two strange doctors as before, of whose names and faces I am ignorant, and were instructed by my friends, I suppose, to sign a certificate. I was then given a strong dose of opium, and a summons was sent to the master of Pecksniff Hall, who dispatched two stout warders northward by the train for the impounding of my Herculean frame. One was the good-natured colonial, the other a man whom I held in especial aversion, a fat ex-footman, who afterwards reported his work as very good fun, and had a particular aptitude, when I was lying helpless in bed, for jumping on my breastbone and half-throttling me. A fancied resemblance in his moony countenance to an historical face made me, when I was one day dreamily contemplating him from bed, connect him vaguely with the Orton family, and among the dramatis personae of my imagination I knew him as young Orton, and whiled away some of my hours by constructing romances about him and the Tichborne inheritance. There was another man, affectionately known to a circle of admiring friends as Birdie, who was so like him that it made me rather angry not to be able to make up my mind which was the truer claimant. It was, at any rate, something to do. But Bertie was good-natured also in his way, though fond of practical joking. I disliked his way of dipping my hairbrush in the basin in the morning, when I was too weak to remonstrate, and using it on his own bullet head under my eyes, but I bear him no grudge. One of his amusements did me some harm, for he had a way of whipping up things in the room and running off with them, to puzzle me, I suppose, laughing all the time. He performed this feat once with the new antimacassar, and from that moment, coupled with the indescribable disorder and entire absence of all visible supervision over the attendants, which reigned in the big madhouse, it created in my mind a notion that there was more dishonesty in the place than might be. It was a delusion, of course, and the notes must have had much to say to it, the more as, when it became known, some of the men would play on it as an instrument, as I fear they are but too apt to play in ignorance, having but too much opportunity so to do on the weaknesses and fancies of the poor people in their charge. The thing is not worth many words, but it is a very fair instance of the way in which this abominable system tends to create the very things which it is supposed to cure. My reflections upon the Orton family, quite as much of a delusion as the other, are written in no notes but my own. The warders' faces met mine in the morning, and in a wild opium trance, acting on the brain at its weakest, I was removed to my prison again. Once, during the journey, I learn, I spoke, and once only, when the sight of my colonial indulging in a pot of beer woke the healthy British nature to solicit a drink. I do not remember it, for I remember nothing but a confused succession of trains and platforms, till I woke to semi-consciousness in the asylum, to find myself lying on the ground on my back, with a doctor on one side and my old servant, returned from India in the interval, upon the other, contemplating me. This was described as a fit, vaguely. I must have been, like the Yankee of the story, a whale at fits, for I had them of all kinds, epileptic, epileptoid, toid meaning nothing but being substituted when the first diagnosis revealed itself in its native silliness, paralytic in the left arm when I had lain on it in bed for some days and rather numbed it, and any others that came handy. I wish I could see those notes, they must be wonderful. But as in the multitude of counsellors is wisdom, in the multitude of maladies is safety. So began my second term, of 8 months' imprisonment. Was ever such a story told? There shall be but very little more of it.